Shifting sands in the Middle East, rising and falling powers since the 7th of October, 2023 until the present. So, what do we got? A lot has changed in the Middle East in the past years. However, before we get into this, I'd like to just mention for a moment the Naaman Academy. We've been working for 2 years now, educating as much as possible against anti-Semitism, jihadism, the red-green axis, meaning communist Islamism, by working through fact-based analysis. We don't just throw accusations up in the air. Everything is based in fact, as people know from our webinars, from our blogs, and from the courses that we are giving. This is the best way to become educated, to join us, to study with us, to ask questions, to do it in depth, to be a confident member and proactive in your community in order to halt these evils and to defend democracy and our way of life that we are so familiar with and very often take for granted when we live in the West. So don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to the Naaman Academy. Let's dig in. We know that the past 3 years have not been easy, and much has happened. The Middle East has been turned upside down, in some cases on its head, in other cases falling sideways. There are a lot of unknowns. Let's go. First of all, a bit of a review of the October 7th catalyst, which started with the Great Slaughter. Iran was behind much of it, what was known as the 7 Rings of Fire. Right? Overall, the Iranians are the marionneteer pulling the strings. Yes, Hamas attacked across the Gaza border, slaughtered some 1,200 people, the vast majority of them Israelis and civilians, in that horrible day almost 3 years ago. What has happened since then? Israel went on the offensive. First absorbed the attacks and then began counterattacks. Hezbollah has been greatly weakened. The Lebanese, right? Shiite Lebanese extremist group that's totally aligned with Iran. The Shiite Houthis in Yemen have been contained. Gaza and the West Bank, as we know, Gaza has not been totally captured, but the majority, and Hamas is up against the wall. But they're still alive and kicking. In the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, there were attempts at uprisings by Hamas, what could be called a low-intensity conflict. It was very much held back, and most of it broken. Yes, there are still challenges there, no doubt. The Iraqi Shiite militias got involved somewhat, but have been warned not to, and they're always sitting on the fence. They have quite a bit of weaponry, and they have used it at times against Israel. And as for Assad, Syria collapsed. Just that the problem is today, the Turks, through President Ashara, they're the ones in control, and they are no more pro-Israel than the Iranians are. Iran itself and its proxy allies spent a fortune on battling Israel and going to war in the jihad framework and understanding. They did not spend it on their populace. So what's happened? It's true. Israel suffered a fair amount of damage. They've suffered a lot more with Israeli responses, but even more so because of the civilian breakdown of infrastructure. Iran, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, especially when it comes to water, agriculture, and electrical grids. We've discussed this before in depth. And climate change is intensified, and there's no response from these jihadi types because their real objective is destruction, not only of Israel, but of the West. Here we have a picture on the left of a hostage being taken in that October 7th disaster. And on the right-hand side, we have those active players in the Middle East. So, first of all, who are the greatest losers? Well, the Palestinians. As much as they started it, and as we know, Yahya Sinwar figured that they would win, they'd get a lot of allies, they would crush Israel, it didn't work out. However, there have been some diplomatic forays, especially by the United States. The 20-point outline that President Trump put together with his team almost a year ago and came to the Knesset and spoke about that this war has ended. And it was just exactly 2 years of the war itself. Since then, there's been somewhat of an attrition. And there is the 15-point implementation plan, just this past July 31st. Israel has rejected the stipulation that there would need to be a withdrawal before or at the same time that Hamas is disarmed. In other words, Israel, and rightfully so, is demanding that Hamas be disarmed first because nobody trusts them. Okay? Yes, it does speak about a Palestinian state in both the 15 and 20-point outlines. Very interesting. We have a government that says it's very right-wing, but it has accepted what President Trump has demanded, along with his Arab allies. So, with that, there's to be established the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, the NCAG, and there to be a technocratic government. Let's take a look. Gaza has pretty well been destroyed 70 to 80%. Some people say more. Maybe it's 85%. These two documents are a roadmap to a Palestinian state with this technocratic administration. Hamas is disarmed, as we mentioned. There was a whole question whether they be allowed light weapons because the agreement, the first one, alludes to disarmament. The second one speaks of disarming, but with heavy equipment, therefore leaving out light weapons. They're still very dangerous. Rifles, grenades, whatever you want. Israel is to withdraw. As I mentioned, it ain't happening until Hamas is disarmed, and that is a very serious obstacle because we know they refuse to disarm, and there's supposed to be economic development. Does Hamas care that the Palestinian people should benefit in the end from this agreement? Not really. They prefer the jihad. Residents of Gaza, it's made very clear, can remain. If they don't want to remain, they can leave. And there are a couple of committees that are there to make sure everything works out. What's known as the International Verification Committee, which is IDC, and the ISF, the International Stabilization Force, which only has 200 soldiers from something like 8 different countries, right? And yes, you've heard of the Board of Peace, set up by Trump, with all the different countries involved in it, especially Muslim countries, Turkey, very much involved. It's very concerning for Israel. And of course, the NCAG, and they're supposed to rebuild Gaza. So here's a picture of Rafah, or Rafah is called in English, and its destruction after the battles with Israel, and what's known as the yellow line in Gaza, where the dark green is what Hamas holds, but actually that line's moved a bit because of clashes between Israel and Hamas in recent months. So taking a look, who's the winner? The big winner, and we've discussed this previously, are the Turks. Interestingly enough, not really involved in all the war, just operating their proxy in Syria. And of course, that regime fell a year and a half ago. But let's take a look. Here you have Erdogan in the middle. What was done? We take a look on the left-hand side. We see the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, part of Mesopotamia, right? We know from our ancient history that this was a breadbasket of the Middle East and civilizations that developed there at the same time as ancient Egypt. What is going on? Because rivers are the lifeline of Syria and Iraq. So, the policy of Neo-Ottomanism is to rebuild the Ottoman Empire. At the bottom of the screen, you see the Ottoman Empire at the height of its power in 1566 under Suleiman the Magnificent. This is what Erdogan wants. And beyond that, if we go into the Central Asian republics, which would be to the right in that, where are the pressure points? Water, of course. In southeastern Turkey, and I will use the cursor, okay? Southeastern Turkey here, right? They have dams, right? Southern Turkey, I should say, when we speak about the Euphrates, that are blocking the rivers, and Syria loses some 40% of the Euphrates River. It's being used in Turkey, those waters. Iraq, 60% of the Tigris and Euphrates waters are blocked together because, after all, Syria is taking some. The Tigris does not really flow through Syria. It's just on the border there. So the Turks are holding it back. And this is the leverage they use in order to force these two countries to become client states. As we know, Syria is already there and Iraq is on the way. Iraq is somewhat squeezed between Iran, Turkey, and the United States. However, we know that the Americans are very pro-Turkish. We'll be getting to that in a few moments. Jordan is attempting to balance Turkish influence because there are Western interests in Jordan, and Jordan is Israel's longest border. And of course, very concerning if there's a lot of Turkish influence there. Speaking about Lebanon, which borders Syria, and the Sunnis there are a minority, maybe 15%, they actually prefer Saudi patronage. So there's this battle heating up between the Turks and some other forces. Well, I think one could safely say at the moment, they for sure are the biggest winners. So are the Iranians in decline? I put a question mark there. The answer is yes, but they're not out of the game, right? Because they still have their rocket launchers, as we see here. And we have the map of the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. Let's take a look. They are very dependent on the Memorandum of Understanding negotiated by J.D. Vance, which many people see as a total disaster for Western interests, for the United States, and certainly for Israel. But President Trump, it's his administration. So the Iranians are on the ropes. The country was pretty well battered in a series of conflicts, especially the last one that took place for the most part during March, began on February 28th. They attacked the Arab Gulf oil-producing states, and they too have somewhat their backs against the wall, although their economic situation is much better than in Iran. However, the MOU promises to unfreeze $324 billion in frozen assets and bring aid to Iran. In other words, to rehabilitate Iran, and they can actually decide where to use the money. Nobody says they have to use it for civilian development. They can even give it to Hezbollah or Hamas if they want, right? There's supposed to be a lift of the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, but that wasn't made very clear. It's left up in the open, and that's where the clash is nowadays between the Trump administration and the Iranians. They're saying we demand to have tolls. It was supposed to be negotiated. They share the strait with Oman. Will it be done? Can it be done? Oman is one of the brokers between the U.S. And Tehran. They too have been attacked. Very interesting, because the Iranians are making it clear, if we go under, we take everybody with us. Should this MOU actually be implemented, the Iranians will be back on their feet. It won't be immediate, takes time, but they will become much more solvent. What are they attempting to do? Of course, undermine all those Arab Gulf states, rearm themselves, especially with missiles. There's the whole question of the nuclear program. And yes, put an end to the internal opposition. As you remember, President Trump said help is on the way. Somewhat it was, but apparently with you look at the MOU, it's not on the way. If it will actually be implemented, and it may not be. Americans are speaking of waiting till after the midterm elections to see what to do. Just a holding pattern. There should be pressure against the Iranians. And as we know, there's the critical day zero water crisis sometime between now and 2030. But do the IRGC and the Ayatollahs, do they really care? My answer to that has always been no. As long as they're in power, population can suffer, can die, whatever. So let's take a look at the proxies. First of all, Hezbollah is badly battered, but also still standing. And they have issues with the amount of rockets and small weapons. Israel has captured parts of South Lebanon, not all those areas that were used to launch attacks against Israel. But in the meantime, in June, there was the peace agreement framework that was put together through the Americans, Marco Rubio, as opposed to J.D. Vance. We noticed the difference. And Rubio wanted to have, and it's written down, a full agreement between Israel and Lebanon, and that eventually led to President Joseph Aoun meeting with Donald Trump in the White House to move this forward. Now, Hezbollah is totally against any peace agreement. Internationally, it's actually more positive because the Lebanese government is anti-Hezbollah, wants to agree with Israel. Doesn't mean they agree to everything that's said and done by Israel. And there's more and more different communities in Lebanon are anti-Hezbollah, and you have a bit of opposition within the Shiites. The Houthis in Yemen are still in full control, battling Saudi Arabia. They've got the upper hand. It's heating up, but the Saudis can attack them, and they will fire rockets, drones at oil facilities, and therefore Riyadh is very much on its back foot. There's also the blockade of Bab el-Mandeb, just like the Iranians block Strait of Hormuz, they block the Bab el-Mandeb, and you put the two together, that's something like 1/3 of energy shipping worldwide, close to it, 30% to 1/3. So they have some serious pressure points. As for the Iraqi Shiite militias, they have close ties with Iran, but there's a lot of pressure by their own government, as well as the United States and Turkey. Okay, and here we have a picture, lower part of the screen showing Houthi demonstrators against Israel, America, and for the jihad. So, what about the Arab Gulf states? Are they on the edge of an abyss? Which question that has to be asked. We show here from Qatar's LNG facilities and desalination plant, just a picture from the inside. Okay, and those are the two pressure points. Now, people often think in terms of oil. As you know, I do, but I don't consider it the most important threat. Because you know what? If you don't have oil production and things break down with oil, the Gulf states have plenty of money in the bank and they can manage in other ways. It doesn't mean that they want their oil economies to fall apart or their energy economy, right? We know Qatar is much more dependent on LNG. So Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, and Oman, they're the ones who are in the game. What is really threatened? The desalination plants. That would be the end of those societies, should they get wiped out. Now, nobody's saying it has to happen, but we know with the Iranians, with their back to the wall, hey, anything can take place. Remember, jihadis, what's the biggest problem that the Arab Gulf states have alongside of the Americans? There are very seriously depleted interceptor rockets. That's why the Americans couldn't go ahead with any sort of attack, because the Gulf states would have gotten pounded, and that for sure would have crashed international energy economy, as well as quite possibly destroyed a good portion of those societies if water is no longer really available. Okay, so is everybody forced to give in to the Iranian demands? Well, you're in a lull at the moment. We will see. It will take a few months. And in the meantime, summer is just as brutal, if not more so, than last year. And that was pretty bad. Two players considered to be somewhat on the outside, but who are quite important because of the size of their populations and their economies, even if their economies don't do that well. Say Pakistan and Turkey and Saudi Arabia have an alliance just recently, and Egypt may join it. The question is for whom and for what. But these two countries, there are questions of economic and food insecurity. Talking of Egypt, population 120 million, Pakistan 260 million. That's close to 400 million people. So we know Egypt suffers from less water in the Nile and a population that just keeps growing, as well as depleted silt deposits there because of the Aswan Dam. And now there's a massive dam built in Ethiopia that's making things even worse, right? It's upstream in the Nile. Pakistan, alternating floods and droughts. And those Arab Gulf states that continually fund and guarantee those economies, they're under pressure. It's not to say that they won't fund them, okay? But there's pressure. If there'll be more and more, something could crack, right? Everybody's got to avoid default on the economic level, right? If the country no longer has credit, it really is a disaster, because the biggest problem they would have, of course, is feeding the population. And bread, or pitot, right, in the Middle East, that is the staple of life. Their own harvests are very much impeded. And if we speak about the Russian-Ukraine war, we know a lot of exports are just not happening. Ukrainians have been under attack for a long time, but now with Kyiv hitting Russian energy facilities, they're short on fuel to run the combines for the harvest in Russia. And these are the two biggest bread baskets in the world, if we put them together, right? Be the largest bread basket in the world for cereals, grains, or whatever else export, especially to the Middle East. One could expect the grain prices to go up. If it goes too high and there's not the subsidies there should be in these countries, it could be a lot of social instability. In other words, something to keep your eye on, because people aren't generally looking there. Everybody's looking at the Strait of Hormuz. We have to make sure that food is available, because these countries, tens of millions live on the edge. I should actually say hundreds of millions. And what about Israel? Everybody figures Israel was a big winner in this war, and the answer is not exactly. Someplace in the middle. Yes, Israel defended itself. Yes, there was a lot of damage done to the Iranians and their proxies. Hey, no doubt about that. However, internally, right, and we know Israel's had a lot of issues, especially over the ultra-Orthodox draft and the country being very split. A large portion, I'd say the majority, are against the government. The question would be whether that opposition could form a government, because out of 120 seats in the Knesset, some 10 seats that are gotten by the Arab parties when elections are over. And therefore, you could end up having 58, 59 seats, but that's not a majority of 61, let's say, for the opposition. and the Netanyahu bloc could have, let's say, 51, 52. But then the question is, what about the other 10? Would they be involved in government? Okay, there was a point when a few years ago they supported the government, but they weren't really in the coalition as having ministers in the government. Election outcome about another 2.5 months from now is going to be very important. Israel is a forward base for American interests. You have that opposition group of Bennett, Lapid, and Eisenkot. When their political parties discuss what they would do, could there be a Palestinian state, something of which the present government has agreed to, right? Article 19 in the agreement from October of 25, and Article 1, like as I was called, in your face, that was just broached to Israel. And by the way, Netanyahu did not say he's against the Palestinian state. His argument is that Hamas has to disarm first. Okay? So that's what there's all these articles out there saying Netanyahu rejects the agreement. No, he rejected a specific part of it. You have to read those articles carefully and not just the headline. Okay? So what is the opposition speaking about? What's known as the Alone Plan revisited their territorial compromise for the West Bank and Gaza, but essentially that there would be an expanded autonomy and some sort of truncated Palestinian mini-state, possibly, but not really as a state. And none of the opposition groups call it a state. As for what today's coalition, and led by, let's say, the religious Zionists would say, Bezalel Smotrich, the party leader, he really speaks of annexation of Judea Samaria, what's called the West Bank, as almost greater land of Israel policy. That's where we stand in dealing with the Palestinians. I want to just touch on what was going to happen after the elections. What does Israel really need? Because there's also the American midterms, and as we know, the bipartisan support enjoyed by Israel for decades and decades has pretty much come to an end. The Democratic Party is furious at the Netanyahu government. Apparently, there is sympathy for Israel, but there are votes against Israel because of the government. That's what they say. Okay, this hopefully will settle out more to Israel's favor, and that moderate Democrats will be the candidates, and either they'll win or the Republicans. But if you have some of those DSA types, Israel's in deep trouble. You know, like the candidate for the Democratic Party in Michigan, who's very, very anti-Israel. Israel needs a foreign policy realignment in part to restart with Europe, the EU, and India. The assumption is that you won't have exactly this government that you have today after the October 27th election. If so, then there will not be a policy realignment, most likely. Yes, more somewhat towards India, but certainly not towards Europe. The Europeans quite despise Netanyahu. We do know Europe's undergoing an anti-Islamic backlash, so when they have elections coming up in another few years, quite possibly shift to the right. You saw that in Latin America, in Colombia, okay, where they recognized Israel's annexation of the Golan, which was done in 2019 when Trump recognized it. Now they're following in his footsteps. The annexation actually was in 1981. Okay, so there are shifts going on, but they're not enormous. And we'll just have to see what the next few years hold. That's why I say not to be, people get overly pessimistic, because I know there's a lot of stuff in the works. There are joint interests in confronting this jihadi Islam, just that people have to be aware of what's going on. And as we said, not only that support that was from the Democrats that isn't there as previous, there's that far right in the Republican Party, there's that Nazi influence under Nick Fuentes, but there are others. We know Tucker Carlson, and there are the hardline, some of the hardline MAGA, who don't want much to do with Israel. So we have to see. A lot of things are in flux. 3-4 months from now, we're going to be a lot smarter. And of course, our summation, the neo-Ottoman Turkish domination, that is what I would say the number one issue. All right. Turkey's the rising Middle Eastern NATO power, and there's the Turkish-Pakistani-Saudi alliance just signed. Egypt might join. I alluded to it before. Who is it against? Some people say Israel. I say it's also dealing with the Iranians. Yes, it's pressure on Israel because Erdogan despises the Jewish state. The Gulf states would like an alliance. They're very afraid of Iran. They are not afraid of Israel. As we said, Iran is down and out, but there are unknowns, certainly about the MOU, its implementation. We don't know when the war ends. We don't know what's going to be the result of Israel's elections, nor of the American midterms. Climate factors, which are often not even discussed. I don't want to say discounted because not even discussed. These brutally hot Middle East summers are making it impossible almost to live in certain places, right? And yes, you have the war between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and winter will set in there. And if the harvest isn't out by the end of summer, and there are breakdowns by winter, planting season is also going to be very problematic. Come around towards spring. Okay, we have to look forward a year from now. We know much of the water systems throughout the Middle East are in deep trouble, and therefore we have agricultural bankruptcy. In other words, dependency on others abroad. So this leads to grain scarcity, price rises, and an intensified crisis throughout much of the region, which people, once again, they're not focused there. Why? It's not a war. And wars grab the headlines. This stuff is more mundane, but just as dangerous. So, continuing and discussing about the Naaman Academy, we urge you to become a sponsor and support our independent source-based education. Go into the website and become a partner with us in getting the information out there. Your donation, your support is very, very significant to move this forward and to get out fact-based understandings so we can all battle back against those who don't like democratic way of life and undermining the Jewish people and our freedoms, our values. We have our courses, Anti-Semitism from Farah to Facebook is 6 modules, as well as Exposing Islamic Jihad, Safeguarding Humanity. These 2 courses make the core of the Naaman Academy, and it's here that one learns in depth how to confront these threats against the Jewish people and the Western world. Okay, and as usual, right, we have our credits. Okay, and thank you very much. And now for your questions.